So,
look, I want to speak.
Dr. Stephen Chavura.
I want to speak briefly, and I want to speak very generally, mainly about how we need to think about religious freedom, and also in terms of understanding how, quite frankly, the enemy is going to be conceptualizing and describing the problem with Christianity in Australia. So I really have two things that I want to say. And then actually I really encourage you to keep asking Alex questions, because Alex is actually an expert on this legislation. So don't feel out of pity that you have to start asking me questions. I don't mind. This is the man today to ask questions about the nuts and bolts of the legislation and things like that. If I can answer any questions, I'm happy to, but please keep asking Alex questions. First, I think we ought to get into the habit of thinking of religious freedom as not solely as something that's good for religious believers like everyone at this table, certainly myself, but we need to get into the habit of thinking of religious freedom as something that is good for all Australians, as a way of loving our neighbour. Now, the reason I say that it's a good thing to get into the habit of thinking it like this is that when we constantly tell people outside of the churches, this is bad for us, this is bad for us, that's not necessarily going to inspire them to care. But if we can show them that this is actually bad for all Australians, then A, it doesn't look like we think we're a bunch of victims, and B, it actually gets them to think about their own well-being, and that may actually raise some interest in wider Australia. Now, people come to Australia and people stay in Australia because we've basically got a lot of freedom here. It's a great country, it's prosperous. The thing is, let's think of this Israel Folau case. Raylene Castle, Rugby Australia. Did Raylene Castle and Rugby Australia sack Israel Folau because he was religious? No, they didn't. They don't really care that Israel Folau is religious. You know, half the team are Tongan, half the team on the rugby agree with Israel Folau. People in this book are not harassed because they are religious. They are harassed because they have views that disagree with the ideologies of some elites. So whether you're religious or not, it's actually irrelevant, because what's actually going on is not so much religious persecution, it's persecution of anyone who disagrees with progressive left-wing ideology. If Folau was an atheist, and came out and said, you know something, I don't agree with homosexuality, I think it's unnatural, I don't believe in same-sex marriage, you know, they're my views. Rugby Australia still would have sacked him, you know, again, because he has views that disagree with a very powerful group of progressive elites. And so what we need to do is point out to Australians that, you know, standing up for religious freedom is not standing up for religion. It's standing up for every Australian's right to be able to speak and not be punished by powerful people who disagree with them. Now, that's a right that any Australian should really value. So, again, of course, this is in many ways a threat to religionists like you and me. But we've got to think more broadly than that, that this is a really bad law for everyone. And a lot of people will say, oh, you know, you Christians, you shouldn't... Many Christians will say this, unfortunately. They'll say, oh, you Christians, you know, or we Christians, we shouldn't be focusing so much on our own rights, on religious liberty. We've got to think about other people. What they fail to understand is that religious liberty is good for everyone. And what they fail to understand is that the people who are making other people's lives difficult don't care whether you're religious or not. They just care about what you believe. And that's something that affects everyone. So that's the first thing I will say. The second and final thing I will say is that what we have to start thinking very carefully about is the allegation that is constantly being made against Christianity and conservative Christians, Bible-believing Christians, tradition-based Christians, that our variety of Christianity is harmful. Okay, so once upon a time, you know, people who disagreed with Christianity, they said, oh, Christianity, it's irrational. Don't be a Christian, it's irrational. People also once upon a time said, well, you shouldn't be a Christian because Christianity is immoral. It's immoral. Nowadays, the great accusation against Christianity is that it is a harm to people's mental health. That is the argument that you are constantly going to be hearing. Why was Israel Folau sacked? The problem that Rugby Australia and Raylene Castle and other media commentators had with Israel Folau was never that his words were offensive. It was never that he offended someone. It was that Israel Folau's words on homosexuals are going to be detrimental to the mental health of homosexuals. And that was one of the arguments against having a debate on same-sex marriage. People said we shouldn't be having this debate. Of course, 7 years earlier they were saying we should have the debate because they weren't confident that the politicians would vote in favour of same-sex marriage. But they were saying, no, we shouldn't have this debate. Why? Because it's going to be detrimental to the mental health of young Australians. So Christianity now is being conceptualised as a threat to people's mental health. You've got to start thinking a lot about how we're going to counter that argument. And there are several ways that we can counter that argument. I'll go through 3 ways. Number one, and I'm not saying that you gentlemen here have to do this personally, but it's something that we need to be encouraging people who do this sort of thing full time to start looking into. Number one, look at the literature that argues that traditional conservative biblical Christianity is bad for people's mental health. When you look at the literature, you'll find that it's actually, the arguments are quite bad. You'll find that they're quite bad, and you'll find actually that there's a lot of literature that says quite the opposite. So we need to argue against the idea that Christianity is bad for people's mental health. Second, we need to argue in favour of the fact, this is a fact, that in fact Christianity is actually good for people's mental health. It's actually a good thing statistically to be a practicing Christian. You're going to be happier, you're going to be healthier, you're not going to be as afflicted with depression, and your family probably has a greater likelihood that it's going to succeed as a family and stay together. So we need to actually counter the mental harm argument by pointing out that in actual fact, if you care about mental health, if you care about all forms of health, then in actual fact you will support Christianity. You won't knock it, because in actual fact Christianity is good for people's mental health. Third and final thing I'm going to say is that the best way to counter arguments that Christianity is harmful is for us as Christians to be living lives in accordance with our beliefs. So when people see the rest of society crumbling, when they see this appalling transgender ideology infiltrating the schools and destroying the minds of children, when they see the chronic porn addiction that is vitiating society at large, destroying individuals and destroying relationships and destroying families, when they see all these sorts of things, when they see families falling apart for various reasons, and they look at us Christians who've got our lives together, whose families are going very well, it makes it very difficult to say that Christianity is detrimental or bad for society. And possibly that's the most powerful thing that we can do over the next few years. That is to actually live our lives as individuals, as families and as institutions in accordance with the character of Jesus himself. We should be optimistic that we can make a change, because as Alex and as Nella said early on, we have actually made changes very recently. I was at the protests for those abortion marches in New South Wales. I went to nearly every one of them, and let me say, they were very, very powerful, and it's amazing actually that we got some significant amendments to that abortion law. You know something, when we were outside Parliament protesting, people in Parliament were laughing at us. They were laughing, saying, you guys are flogging a dead horse. You're backing a dead horse. You guys aren't going to accomplish anything. Well, the fact is, actually, some really good things were accomplished. Some serious amendments were made. Same thing with this Religious Discrimination Act. The first draft of this act, I think, was pretty hopeless. It was pretty bad. People wrote in submissions, people protested, we wrote articles to the newspapers, and lo and behold, we actually have a significantly improved version of this. So we are not helpless here. We can actually make positive changes, and in terms of doing that, I just remind you of the things that Nella and Alex have already said about that. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. And thanks to the saints out the back for a delicious cup of coffee.